Look who's still breathing. Welcome back. Still here, still intact, still unmistakably you. They really thought this would end differently. They thought pressure would thin you out. That confusion would loosen your grip on yourself. That enough emotional noise, enough doubt, enough quiet erosion would make you forget who you were before all of this began. They didn't need spectacle. The plan was subtler than that. Cleaner, psychological. Make you question your own instincts. Make you second. Guess your memory. Make you doubt your worth until you started doing the work for them. And for a moment, they almost believed it worked. You felt it, didn't you? That stretch of time where the ground beneath you didn't feel solid anymore. Where every reaction was analyzed, every feeling interrogated. Where you were encouraged to explain yourself again and again until your own voice started to sound foreign. That wasn't coincidence. That was design, a carefully constructed environment meant to shrink you without ever touching you. But here you are, breathing, present, awake. That's the part they didn't plan for, because the strategy depended on one assumption: that you would panic, that you would cling, that you would trade clarity for comfort and certainty for approval. They expected collapse, compliance, or at least confusion loud enough to exploit. Instead, something else happened. You went quiet. Not defeated quiet. Observant quiet. The kind of quiet where you stop reacting and start seeing. That's when the roles began to reverse. The one meant to destabilize you arrived with scripts. You could feel it, the timing of their words, the way concern was mixed with doubt, how validation was offered just long enough to make withdrawal sting. They knew the techniques, emotional leverage disguised as care. Questions framed to sound helpful while subtly undermining your confidence. A slow, steady pressure meant to make you outsource your sense of self. But you weren't new to this terrain. You've survived confusion before. You've walked through moments where your reality was questioned by people you trusted. You've learned the difference between guidance and control, between curiosity and manipulation. So instead of unraveling, you watched, you listened, you noticed patterns. You felt when something didn't align, and alignment matters to you more than comfort now. They tried to isolate you emotionally, suggesting that no one really understood you, that you were too intense, too different, too much. That technique usually works. It makes people desperate to belong. It makes them soften their edges, dilute their truth. But when they said it to you, something unexpected happened. You didn't flinch. You didn't rush to prove them wrong. You didn't bargain for acceptance. You recognized solitude for what it was. Space. Space to hear yourself clearly. Space to stand without leaning. That realization shook them. Then came the doubt, seeding, gentle at first. A raised eyebrow, a casual contradiction, a suggestion that maybe your memory wasn't precise, maybe your perception was colored, maybe your confidence was a defense mechanism. That tactic depends on repetition, on the target slowly adopting someone else's interpretation as their own. But you've already paid the price of ignoring your intuition once in your life. You don't make that mistake anymore. So instead of absorbing the doubt, you reflected it. You asked questions, not aggressively, not defensively, just enough to expose inconsistencies, just enough to reveal how rehearsed their certainty was. You noticed how often they redirected instead of answering, how often control masqueraded as concern. And for the first time, the one who came prepared wasn't fully in control of the room. You could feel it shift. They weren't destabilizing you anymore. They were adjusting to you. And that's when the discomfort started bleeding through, subtle at first, A hesitation where confidence used to be. A pause where the script should have flowed. You weren't supposed to stay whole. You weren't supposed to remain grounded. You weren't supposed to keep your sense of self intact while standing under that kind of pressure, yet you did. Not because you outmaneuvered them, but because you refused to abandon yourself to make things easier. They tried closeness next. Emotional proximity offered like a solution. Understanding presented as dependency, the suggestion that they were the only one who truly saw you. That move has trapped countless people. It creates loyalty through relief, but you recognize the pattern. You've learned that real understanding doesn't require ownership, that support doesn't demand surrender. So when they pulled back to provoke need, you didn't chase. When warmth turned cold, you didn't beg for the temperature to change. You stayed steady, and that steadiness did something none of their training accounted for. It made them question themselves. You saw it in the micro expressions, the recalibration, the moment where their certainty cracked just enough to let curiosity in. They came to reshape you, but your presence held up a mirror instead. And mirrors are dangerous to anyone who survives by avoiding their own reflection. They started noticing things they'd been trained not to notice. How often they relied on scripts instead of sincerity. How much of their authority came from assumption rather than truth. How fragile control feels when it's no longer reinforced by reaction. Your authenticity wasn't loud, but it was consistent. And consistency is destabilizing to anything built on performance. You weren't immune because you were aggressive. You were immune because you were integrated. That's the part no one teaches. Self-trust isn't arrogance, it's coherence. It's what happens when your thoughts, instincts, and boundaries stop arguing with each other. And once that happens, manipulation has nothing to hook into. They began losing their footing. You could sense it. Their attempts to steer the dynamic felt heavier, less precise. Instead of guiding, they were grasping. Instead of influencing, they were reacting. You didn't need to confront them with accusations. Their discomfort was already telling you everything. And here's the quiet truth. They didn't want to face. You didn't break because you weren't brittle to begin with. You've already been dismantled by life in ways no technique could replicate. You've rebuilt yourself without applause, without instruction, without someone telling you who to be next. That kind of reconstruction leaves behind something solid, something that doesn't shatter under scrutiny. So when the pressure peaked, when the moment arrived where you were supposed to fold, you didn't rise or retaliate. You remained intact. You stayed present. You didn't abandon your inner compass to make the tension stop, and that's when the encounter truly reversed. They came prepared to influence you. They left questioning themselves, not because you persuaded them, not because you argued, but because authenticity, when sustained, exposes false structures naturally. Control collapses when belief is withdrawn. Influence evaporates when fear no longer fuels it. You weren't the one at risk in that interaction. You were the variable they couldn't account for, the one who didn't fracture under pressure, the one who didn't outsource identity for approval. And somewhere along the way, they realized something unsettling. You weren't playing a game. You weren't posturing. You weren't trying to win. You were simply being fully, deliberately. Without asking permission, that realization lingers. It follows them. It unsettles the frameworks they rely on. As for you, you didn't walk away triumphant. You walked away unchanged. Still breathing, still grounded, still sovereign in a way that doesn't need witnesses. This isn't the end of the story. The tension hasn't fully resolved yet. There's more unfolding beneath the surface, more recalibration happening where control once felt secure. But for now, this much is clear. You're still here, and you didn't survive by becoming smaller. And that's where the misunderstanding lives. They thought survival would change you, that enduring that kind of pressure would carve something away, leave you quieter, softer, more compliant. They assumed that anyone who walks through sustained psychological strain comes out diminished. But what they never learned, what their frameworks don't account for, is this: pressure doesn't only crush. Sometimes it clarifies. You didn't come out hardened. You came out precise. Where you once questioned your instincts, you now listen. Where you once over-explained, you now pause. Where you once tried to be understood, you now understand yourself well enough that misunderstanding doesn't threaten you. That shift is subtle, but it's seismic, because the world is built to respond to noise, not stillness, to reaction, not restraint, to fracture, not cohesion. And you stopped fracturing. That's why the dynamic never went back to normal. You may have returned to familiar spaces, familiar conversations, familiar roles, but something underneath refused to resume its old shape. You noticed it first in how people spoke to you differently, how explanations felt unnecessary, how certain lines were no longer crossed. Not because you enforced them loudly, but because your presence quietly signaled consequence. You weren't intimidating. You were resolved. There's a difference. Intimidation relies on threat. Resolution relies on certainty. And certainty doesn't announce itself. It settles in the room before words do. People feel it in the way you no longer rush to fill silence, in the way you don't grasp for reassurance, in the way your no doesn't come wrapped in guilt or apology. That kind of self-possession disrupts expectations. Those who once relied on your reactions started feeling unsteady. Not because you changed the rules, but because you stopped playing by the unspoken ones. The emotional contracts that were never negotiated, but always enforced, no longer applied to you. You didn't rebel against them. You simply stopped signing them. And that's when you began to see something clearly. Most systems of influence don't survive confrontation. They survive participation. They rely on people explaining themselves, defending their boundaries, justifying their needs. They rely on the constant exchange of emotional energy to stay relevant. When someone opts out of that exchange, the system doesn't explode. It stalls, it hesitates, it reveals its dependence. You saw that hesitation. You saw it in the way conversations looped back to you, waiting for a reaction that never came. In the way certain people tried to reinsert themselves into your inner world, not aggressively, but curiously, testing whether access still existed. You didn't shut doors dramatically. You simply didn't reopen them. And the absence of reaction did more than any confrontation ever could. Because silence, when it's rooted in clarity, forces reflection. It removes the distraction of conflict and leaves only the truth of the dynamic exposed. People are used to friction. They're less prepared for neutrality. Neutrality doesn't validate their role. It doesn't confirm their power. It doesn't give them anything to push against. You became unpushable, not rigid, not closed, just anchored. There's a moment that happens after prolonged psychological pressure ends. A quiet moment where the nervous system recalibrates, where the mind expects another blow that never comes. You felt that moment, the strange stillness after vigilance, the space where you realize you don't need to brace anymore, and instead of filling that space with noise, you let it stay empty. That's where integration happened. You didn't need to reframe the experience as victory or loss. You didn't need to label anyone a villain or yourself a survivor. You simply absorbed the lesson that you don't lose yourself under pressure, that your identity doesn't dissolve when challenged, that clarity is not something others grant you. It's something you maintain. And once you know that, fear loses its leverage. The manipulative structures you encountered depended on uncertainty, on the idea that your sense of self was negotiable, that your boundaries were temporary, that your values could be reshaped under the right conditions. But they misjudged the foundation. You weren't improvising who you were remembering. That's why, when the confrontation ended, nothing dramatic followed. No collapse, no triumph. Just a quiet continuation of your life, now lived from a different center. You noticed how much energy you had reclaimed simply by not managing other people's expectations. How much mental space opened up when you stopped rehearsing explanations that were never truly heard. You began moving differently. Not faster, not louder, just cleaner. Decisions took less time. Doubt didn't spiral the way it used to. You trusted the initial signal instead of interrogating it into silence. And that trust created a kind of internal alignment that can't be mimicked. It shows up in posture, in timing, in restraint. Others feel it even if they can't name it. Some mistook it for distance, some for indifference, some for superiority. But none of those interpretations mattered because you weren't performing a stance, you were inhabiting one. And inhabited positions don't require explanation. Here's the part that completes the circle. The encounter wasn't about you being tested. It was about a false structure encountering something it couldn't assimilate. You didn't win because you overpowered it. You won because you didn't need to. The pressure had nothing to grip once you stopped offering yourself as material. That's the quiet paradox. Manipulation collapses when compliance is removed. Control dissolves when fear is no longer negotiated with. Influence ends when attention is withdrawn from its terms. You didn't escape by running. You didn't survive by hiding. You didn't endure by becoming harder. You remained intact, and that integrity did all the work. Whatever tried to destabilize, you didn't leave with answers. It left with questions. Questions about its own limits, its own dependence, its own fragility when faced with someone who doesn't fracture under scrutiny. As for you, you didn't carry the encounter forward as a wound. You carried it as confirmation. Confirmation that your identity isn't fragile, that your sense of self doesn't require consensus, that your clarity doesn't need permission. You walk forward now without the weight of proving anything, still breathing, still grounded, still unmistakably you. And whatever once believed it could erase you, now understands something it can't undo. You were never the one at risk.